The boxes were already on the porch when Margaret Voss pulled into her son's driveway that evening, her coat still folded the way she had packed it that morning, her name spoken behind a closed door in a voice that did not expect her to hear it. 74 years old, and she stood on a welcome mat that no longer meant it, listening to the sound of a family gathering going on without her. She drove without a destination for the first 11 miles, until the truck seemed to remember a road her hands had forgotten. County Road 9. Gravel, then dirt, then the kind of silence that only exists where no one has driven in a very long time. Somewhere past the sumac and the goldenrod stood a cottage nobody had wanted, built by a woman nobody had bothered to remember. Ruth Anders had raised those walls herself in 1946, board by board, nail by nail, with 2 hands and a debt to no one. The county called it worthless. The family called it forgotten. But Wood remembers who built it, and some houses wait a lifetime for the right person to come home. What waited behind that door was not decay. It was a curtain, washed and hung, in a window that should have held nothing but broken glass. It was a floorboard. Loose in a way that floorboards are not loose by accident. It was a letter folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, written by a hand that had been still in the ground for decades, addressed to a daughter it somehow already knew would come. Some inheritances are written in ink. Others are hidden in coffee cans, behind chimney stones, beneath floors that only give up their secrets to the person willing to kneel down and pry. This is the story of a woman abandoned twice by the people who should have stayed, and of a mother who never really left at all. The invitation had said 6 o'clock, and Margaret Voss had never once in her life been late for anything. She parked her 1991 Ford Ranger at the curb instead of the driveway, out of habit more than manners, and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Through the front window of her son's house, she could see the shapes of people moving, the warm shift of lamplight, a table crowded with dishes she recognized from her own kitchen decades ago. She smoothed her coat, an old wool one with a button that never quite matched the others, and walked up the path she had walked 100 times before. The key did not turn. She tried it twice, gently, the way she might coax a stubborn lock on the cottage door, before she understood that the mechanism itself was new. Brass, unscratched, the kind of lock a man buys at a hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon without telling his mother. She knocked instead, 3 times, and waited on a welcome mat that had been hers before it was anyone else's. When the door opened, it was her daughter-in-law Carol, holding a serving spoon, and a face that tried, for half a second, to arrange itself into surprise. "Margaret," Carol said, "we didn't think you were coming." Behind her, the noise of the gathering did not pause. Forks against plates, a child laughing somewhere near the stairs. Margaret stood on the step and understood, in the plain way a person understands weather, that this was not a misunderstanding to be corrected with an apology and a chair pulled up to the table. Her son Daniel appeared behind his wife, a glass of wine in his hand, and he did not meet her eyes so much as look somewhere near her shoulder, the way people look at a stranger they are trying to be polite to. "We should have called," he said. "Things got complicated. Cheryl thought, we all thought, it might be easier this way." Easier. Margaret turned the word over the way she might turn over a coin to check the date on it. She did not ask what it meant. She had raised 3 children on a school teacher's salary and a widow's pension, and she had learned long ago that explanations offered freely were rarely the honest ones. She looked past Daniel's shoulder at the table set for 12, at the chair that would have been hers pushed in tight against the wall, and she said only, "I see." The boxes came next, carried out by her grandson Tyler, a boy of 19 who at least had the decency to look ashamed of the task he'd been given. 2 boxes, taped shut, her handwriting nowhere on them because she had not packed them herself. A 3rd box held her sewing machine, wrapped in a towel that still smelled of her own kitchen. Tyler set them on the porch without a word and went back inside, and the door closed with a sound too soft to be called a slam, which somehow made it worse. Margaret carried the boxes to the truck one at a time, 74 years old, and her knees told her about every one of them on the porch steps. But she did not ask for help, and none was offered. She set the sewing machine carefully in the truck bed, wedged between the boxes so it would not shift, the way she had once wedged flour sacks and canning jars on the drive back from town when she was a young wife with a farm to run. Habits like that did not leave a person. They only waited. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment before she started the engine. Through the window, she could still see the lamplight, the moving shapes, a life continuing on the other side of glass as though she had never been part of it at all. She did not cry. She had done her crying decades ago, when her husband Elmer died of a heart attack in the hay barn at 51. And she had promised herself then that grief was a thing to be carried quietly, not performed. She put the truck in gear. She drove without deciding to drive anywhere in particular, the way water finds a low place without consulting a map. Route 18 gave way to smaller roads, the street lights thinning, the dashboard clock reading 7:40 when she finally admitted to herself where her hands had been steering all along. County Road none. She had not driven it in over 20 years, not since her mother's funeral. But some part of her still knew every curve of it, the way a hand knows the shape of a tool it has held 1,000 times. At a stoplight 3 miles from the turnoff, she reached across to the glove box for a tissue, and her fingers found instead an old tin box, the kind that once held peppermints, tucked so far back she had forgotten it was there. She did not remember putting it in the truck. She lifted it into her lap and pried the lid with her thumbnail, the metal edge biting cold, and found inside a folded photograph gone soft at the creases. Her mother, Ruth Anders, standing in front of a half-built wall of unpainted lumber, hammer in hand, squinting into a sun that had set sometime around 1946. Margaret had not thought about the cottage in years. It had sat empty since her mother's death, deeded in a tangle none of the siblings had ever bothered to sort out. Too small and too far gone to be worth the argument. She had assumed, without ever quite deciding to assume it, that it belonged to no one now, or to everyone, which amounted to the same kind of nothing. She looked at the photograph a long moment, at her mother's face caught mid-laugh, at the raw new lumber that had once stood for something being built rather than something falling down. The light turned green. Behind her, a horn sounded once, patient rather than angry, and Margaret set the tin box on the passenger seat and drove on. She did not know yet what she would find at the end of that gravel lane, whether the roof still held or the well still gave water, whether 20 years of weather had finished what time always eventually finishes. She knew only that she had nowhere else that had not just told her, in the plainest language a family can use, that she was not wanted. The turn for County Road 9 came up faster than she expected, marked by a leaning sign half swallowed by brush. She slowed the truck and turned onto it, gravel popping under the tires, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time all evening. Whatever weighted down that road, it had not asked her to be easier. It had only asked her to come back. Ruth Anders had been 29 years old and newly widowed when she decided to build a cottage instead of renting a room in town. Margaret had heard the story 100 times growing up, always told the same plain way, without embellishment, the way her mother told most things. Ruth's husband, Harold, had died of influenza in the winter of 1945, leaving her with a small parcel of land off County Road 9 and considerably less money than a widow needed. Rather than sell the land or move in with relatives who offered pity more freely than help, Ruth had walked into the lumber yard in town with $41 in her coat pocket and asked what it would buy. What it bought was rough-cut pine, second-hand nails pried from a barn being torn down 2 farms over, and a promise from the yard owner, a man named Cyrus Bell, that he would not mention to anyone in town that he was selling building lumber to a woman alone. Ruth did not need his discretion so much as his patience, since she paid the balance in installments of $3 and $4 whenever she could scrape it together from mending work and canning she sold at the Saturday market. She dug the foundation trenches herself with a spade, working evenings after her mending was done, and it took her the better part of a month to get the footings level. Margaret had grown up believing this was simply what mothers did, until she was older and understood how rare it actually was. The photograph in the tin box had been taken by a neighbor boy with a borrowed camera sometime in the spring of 1946, capturing Ruth mid-laugh in front of a wall frame she had raised without a single man's hand on the hammer. Margaret remembered her mother telling that particular story with something close to pride, though pride was not a word Ruth used about herself. She called it necessity, plainly, the same way she called the winter cold or the well dry. Margaret had not understood as a child what it meant to build a house out of necessity rather than choice, but she understood it better now, 74 years old, and driving toward that same cottage with 2 boxes and a sewing machine in the truck bed. By the time Margaret reached the county seat the next morning, the recorder's office had just opened, and a young clerk with a name tag, reading Denise, was refilling the coffee machine near the counter. Margaret explained what she needed as plainly as she could. The deed history for a parcel off County Road 9, last owner Ruth Anders, deceased. Denise typed the name into a terminal that looked newer than the building around it and frowned slightly at whatever came back on the screen. She excused herself to pull an older file from a back room, the kind of file drawer that still used actual paper instead of a database. What came back, 10 minutes later, surprised them both. The deed had never been formally transferred out of Ruth's name. Margaret's 3 siblings, Carl, Louise, and their brother Dale, had assumed for decades that the property passed through the estate the ordinary way, distributed and forgotten along with the rest of their mother's modest belongings. In fact, no transfer had ever been filed. The county still listed Ruth Anders as sole owner of record, a woman 2 decades dead, her name sitting untouched in a ledger, while the cottage itself sat untouched in the weeds. Denise slid the photocopy across the counter and said, not unkindly, that someone would eventually need to settle it through probate one way or another. Margaret folded the paper into quarters and put it in her coat pocket, next to the tin box she had not yet let go of since the night before. She thanked Denise, who seemed young enough to be one of her own grandchildren, and walked back out into a parking lot bright with late morning sun. She sat in the truck without starting it, turning the discovery over the way she had turned over the photograph, unsure yet what it meant beyond the plain fact of it. The property was not divided among 4 siblings who had long since stopped speaking of it. It was, on paper at least, still entirely her mother's, waiting the way a held breath waits. She thought of her father-in-law's old expression, one Elmer used to repeat about machinery left out in the weather. It don't fix itself, and it don't get worse on its own schedule either. The cottage had been sitting 20 years untouched, but paper did not decay the way wood did. A deed could wait in a drawer as easily for 20 years as for 2. Margaret started the engine and pulled out onto the main road, no longer driving without a destination the way she had the night before, but toward something now, even if she could not yet name exactly what. The drive back toward County Road 9 took her past the old Bell lumber yard, long since closed, its faded sign still bolted above a door that had not opened in years. Margaret slowed without meaning to, looking at the peeling paint, thinking of a woman 30 years younger than she was now, walking through that door with $41 in her coat and a debt to no one but her own 2 hands. It occurred to Margaret, in the plain, unhurried way thoughts arrive to her these days, that she had spent the last several decades letting other people make decisions about what belonged to her and what did not. Her mother had never once done that. She reached the turnoff for County Road 9 a little past noon, the gravel catching sunlight the way it had the night before under headlights, though everything looked different now in daylight, smaller and more overgrown than memory had kept it. She did not turn onto the lane yet. She sat instead at the junction, engine idling, and looked down the corridor of sumac and goldenrod toward whatever remained of the place her mother had built alone. The paperwork in her pocket said the land was still Ruth's. Margaret understood, sitting there, that in every way that mattered it always had been, and that she was the only one left who remembered why. She put the truck in gear and turned down the lane. The pavement on Route 18 was smooth and gray and gave way, a mile past the old Grange Hall, to a stretch of chip seal that rattled the truck's loose glove box latch. Margaret had driven this transition so many times as a girl that her body still remembered it before her mind caught up. A small drop in the pitch of the tires, a looseness in the wheel that meant the county had stopped caring about this particular stretch of road somewhere around 1980. She kept both hands on the wheel now, out of habit rather than necessity, the way Elmer had taught her decades ago on roads far worse than this one. The glovebox tin box rattled once against the dashboard and went still. After the chip seal came gravel, announced by a change in sound before it was a change in scenery. The tires suddenly loud against stone instead of quiet against tar. Margaret slowed the truck without thinking about it, the way a person slows for weather rather than for a posted sign. On either side, fields that had once been cultivated in tidy rows now stood grown up in goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace. Gone the yellow-white of late summer, waist-high in places, and leaning where the wind had pushed it. She recognized the old Petrakis dairy barn a half-mile off, its roof caved in on the north side, a hole shaped almost like a doorway where the collapse had opened it to the sky. The gravel itself was inconsistent, washboard in the low spots where water pooled after rain, packed hard and pale in the stretches that saw more sun. Margaret's truck was a 1991 Ford Ranger with over 200,000 miles on it, sprung stiff enough that the washboard sections drummed up through the seat and into her teeth. She did not mind it. There was a kind of honesty in a road that told you exactly what kind of road it was. Unlike the driveway she had stood on the night before, smooth blacktop leading to a door that had turned out not to be hers at all. She passed a mailbox leaning at 45 degrees, its flag long since rusted off, the name on the side worn past reading. 3 miles in, the gravel narrowed and the sumac began pressing close from both sides, red-tipped and taller than the truck's mirrors, brushing the doors with a sound like static. This was the stretch Margaret remembered most clearly from childhood, the place where the road seemed to forget it was a road at all, and became instead a suggestion, a corridor the land tolerated rather than welcomed. She had ridden this same stretch on the back of her father's flatbed as a girl of 8, and later walked it in a black dress the day of her mother's funeral, and now she drove it again as a woman old enough to have buried a husband of her own. The sumac had grown, but the narrowing feeling was exactly as she remembered it. The gravel gave out entirely at the old Hollis property line, marked by nothing more than a fence post gone gray and leaning, wire long since fallen and swallowed in the grass. Beyond it, the road became dirt, 2 ruts worn by decades of infrequent tires with a strip of grass growing tall between them, brushing the truck's undercarriage with a soft, continuous hiss. Margaret dropped her speed to something barely faster than walking, easing the truck through a low spot where recent rain had left the ruts soft and dark. She had heard once, from a farmer at the feed store years ago, that a road stops being a road the day nobody minds it, and this one had not been minded in a very long time. The dirt lane curved twice more before the trees closed overhead, a canopy of black walnut and shagbark hickory that Margaret did not remember being nearly so tall, though 40 years will do that to trees left to their own decisions. The light came down through the leaves in moving coins, sliding across the hood of the truck, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees the moment the canopy closed. She rolled her window down halfway and caught the smell of it immediately. Wet leaf mold and walnut husk and something mineral underneath that she recognized after a moment as the smell of a well-gone stagnant. It was not an unpleasant smell so much as an old one, the smell of a place that had been left alone to do whatever places do when no one is watching. Her phone, which she rarely used and had nearly forgotten in the truck's cup holder, showed no bars at all by the time the trees fully closed overhead. Margaret glanced at it once, registered the absence of signal without much concern, and set it face down on the seat beside the tin box. She had lived most of her life without a telephone in her pocket and did not feel the lack of one now. Not on this road. Not with the walnut canopy pressing down and the ruts narrowing further with each turn. Whatever waited at the end of this lane, it would not be something a phone call could prepare her for. The ruts deepened where a culvert had washed out years ago, forcing Margaret to ease the truck up onto the grass shoulder, the undercarriage scraping once against a rock she hadn't seen in time. She winced at the sound, but kept moving, the way Elmer had taught her. Steady throttle, no sudden corrections. Let the truck find its own way through the rough ground. A rabbit broke from the brush ahead and vanished into goldenrod before she could react to it. The lane narrowed once more, down to something barely wider than the truck itself, branches ticking against the side mirrors on both sides at once. Margaret had the sense, driving those last few hundred yards, of a door closing softly behind her with every turn of the wheel, the wider world receding a little more with each rut and washboard ridge. It was not an unpleasant feeling. If anything, it felt like relief. The particular relief of leaving behind a place that no longer wanted her for a place that had never asked her to prove anything at all. The canopy thinned suddenly ahead, a paleness of open sky breaking through the walnut leaves, and Margaret felt her pulse pick up in a way it had not since she was a much younger woman standing at this same threshold. She eased the truck around the final bend, past a boulder she remembered from childhood half sunk into the ground like something surfacing. And there, through a screen of overgrown lilac, gone woody and wild, she saw the first pale outline of a roofline that had not collapsed. She stopped the truck in the middle of the lane, engine idling, and sat for a moment simply looking at it, unwilling yet to close the last distance. 20 years of silence sat behind that lilac hedge. And Margaret Voss, 74 years old, put the truck back in gear and drove the last stretch toward whatever her mother had left standing. The cottage sat exactly where memory had placed it, though everything around it had gone wild in a way memory had not prepared her for. The porch sagged on its left side where a support post had rotted through at the base, tilting the roofline just enough to catch the eye as wrong. 2 of the front windows were broken, jagged crescents of glass still clinging to the frames, and the woodshed off to the side had collapsed entirely into a heap of gray boards and a rusted stovepipe. Margaret shut off the engine and sat for a long moment, listening to the tick of the cooling metal and a chorus of insects that seemed unbothered by her arrival. She got out slowly, her knees stiff from the drive, and stood beside the truck, taking in the full shape of the ruin. 20 years was a long time for a house to be left to the weather, and this one had paid the price of it plainly. The chimney had lost a course of stones near the top, leaving a gap like a missing tooth. A young sumac had rooted itself in the gutter along the north eave and grown nearly 4 feet tall, its red-tipped leaves nodding gently in a breeze that smelled of walnut husk and standing water. Margaret walked closer, boots crunching over a gravel path long since gone to weeds. It was the 3rd window from the left that stopped her cold in the middle of the yard. Every other window on the cottage held either broken glass or the flat gray blankness of grime built up over 2 decades. But that one window was different. Behind clean glass hung a curtain of white lace, gathered neatly at the center, bright in a way that nothing else on the property was bright. It looked freshly laundered, the kind of white that came from a recent wash and a clothesline, not the kind of white that survived 20 years of dust, settling undisturbed. Margaret stood very still, the way a person stands when the ordinary rules of a place have just been quietly broken. She did not call out. There was no one to call out to, not on a lane this overgrown, not this far from any neighbor she could remember. She approached the window slowly, boots careful over uneven ground, and pressed her palm flat against the glass to shield her eyes from the glare. Behind the curtain she could make out the dim shape of a room, a table, what might have been a chair pushed against the far wall, though the interior was too dark to be certain of anything beyond shapes. The curtain itself did not move, undisturbed by whatever draft might have found its way through the old frame. Margaret stepped back into the yard and turned in a slow circle, taking in the property as a whole, the way she might once have surveyed a field before deciding where to plant. The well house still stood at the edge of the clearing, its shingled roof missing several courses but the structure itself upright. The old apple tree her mother had planted the year the cottage was finished stood twisted and split down one side by some long-ago storm, yet still bore a scattering of small hard fruit high in its surviving branches. Everything spoke of neglect except that one window, that one curtain, hung with a care that made no sense against everything surrounding it. She walked the perimeter of the house next, running her hand along the clapboard siding where the paint had weathered to bare silver-gray wood, checking without quite meaning to for other signs of the same kind of care. The back door was swollen shut in its frame, and a stack of split firewood sat under the eave, gray with age, but arranged with a tidiness that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Round stacked bark down the way a person stacks wood who expects to need it again. Margaret paused at the wood pile a long moment. Someone had cut and stacked that wood, and not so very long ago, judging by how little the bark had peeled. She found the porch steps solid enough to bear her weight, though she tested each one before committing, the way Elmer had taught her to test ice on a pond. The front door was unlocked, its hasp broken loose from the frame at some point in the past, hanging by a single screw. Margaret pushed it open with the flat of her hand and stepped into a front room thick with the smell of dust and old wood smoke, motes turning slowly in the shaft of light from the doorway behind her. The room was mostly bare, a single chair, a cold wood stove, a floor of wide pine boards scarred with decades of foot traffic she remembered from childhood. The curtained window was directly across from her, and up close the lace was even more clearly recent, unfrayed at the edges, hung on a simple wire rod that showed no rust at all. Margaret crossed the room and touched the fabric between two fingers, feeling the crisp, clean texture of cotton that had not spent 20 years gathering dust. Someone had been here, not passing through, not squatting for a season, but tending, the way a person tends something they intend to come back to. She let the curtain fall back into place and stood a long moment in the dim room, listening to the settling creak of old wood and her own breathing. Outside, a bird called twice from somewhere in the walnut canopy, and Margaret realized she had been holding herself very still, the way a person holds still when they suspect they are not alone. She was not afraid, exactly. There was nothing in the stillness of the cottage that felt threatening, only unexplained. She walked back out onto the porch and looked again at the tidy woodpile, at the clean window, at the well house with its roof still mostly sound, and felt the pieces arranging themselves into a shape she did not yet have words for. She sat down on the porch steps, testing the wood once more before she trusted her full weight to it, and looked out over the clearing where her mother had once mixed mortar by hand and raised walls board by board with no one's help but her own determination. The late afternoon sun had begun slanting low through the walnut trees, catching the dust still drifting in the open doorway behind her. Whoever had washed that curtain and stacked that wood had done it recently and quietly, and for reasons Margaret could not yet guess. She sat there a long while, the boxes still unloaded in the truck bed, the tin box still on the passenger seat, and let the questions settle around her the way dust settles after a door has been opened for the first time in years. Margaret spent the better part of an hour simply walking the inside of the cottage before she touched anything else, the way a person walks a job site before deciding where to begin. The front room gave onto a narrow kitchen with a cast-iron sink still bolted to the wall, its enamel chipped down to black in a dozen places. And beyond that, a single bedroom, barely large enough for the iron bed frame still standing in one corner. She noted the floor throughout, wide pine boards worn smooth by decades of feet, most of them solid underfoot. A few that gave slightly with a hollow sound she recognized from her own farmhouse kitchen years ago. It was in the front room, 3 feet from the cold wood stove, that one board answered her weight differently than the rest. She knelt down slowly, one hand braced against the floor, and pressed her palm flat against the board in question. It rocked, almost imperceptibly, a give of perhaps 1/8 of an inch where its neighbors held firm. Margaret had spent enough years around Elmer's toolbox to know the difference between a board simply warped by moisture and a board that had been lifted and reset more than once. She went back out to the truck and returned with the one tool she always kept behind the bench seat, a flat pry bar with a curved claw end, its handle taped in one spot where the grip had cracked years ago. She worked the thin end of the bar into the seam at the board's edge, applying pressure the way Elmer had taught her, slow and steady rather than sudden, so as not to split old wood gone brittle with age. The nails gave with a low groan, 2 of them pulling clean, a third snapping off flush with the joist beneath. The board came up in her hands lighter than she expected, and beneath it she found not the bare earth she had braced herself for, but a shallow cavity boxed in with scrap lumber, clearly built rather than simply left. Dust rose in a thin curl toward the afternoon light coming through the doorway. Inside the cavity sat a coffee can, the old Hills Brothers kind with a paper label gone soft and faded, the lid pressed on tight enough that Margaret had to work her thumbnail under the rim to break the seal. When it finally popped free, the sound was small and dry in the quiet room. Inside, folded bills sat wrapped in a strip of waxed paper, along with a scattering of loose coin, quarters, and dimes gone dark with age. Margaret counted it out on the floor beside her, slowly, the way she once counted egg money at her mother's kitchen table. $211 in bills and change both, more than pocket money and less than a fortune, exactly the kind of sum a careful woman might set aside a little at a time. Beneath the folded bills lay a scrap of paper, brittle at the corners, with a few lines in handwriting Margaret would have known anywhere. The same careful, slightly slanted hand that had signed her report cards and written grocery lists on the backs of envelopes. The note was short. It read only that this was for whoever needed it most when the time came, and that the person who found it would know what to do with it, because Ruth had raised her children to know such things without being told twice. Margaret sat back on her heels and read it 3 times before she folded it and set it beside the tin box she had carried in from the truck. She was still kneeling there, the coffee can in her lap, when a sound outside made her go still. Footsteps, unhurried, coming up the overgrown path from the direction of the tree line, and then a voice, older and rough at the edges, calling out that he meant no trespass, only that he'd seen the truck from the road and thought someone might want water, seeing as the well pump out here hadn't worked in years. Margaret rose and went to the door, the coffee can still in one hand, and found an old man standing at a respectful distance in the yard, a plastic jug of water in one hand and something small in the other. He introduced himself as Walt Pruitt, said he lived a half-mile off through the trees, on the parcel that had once belonged to the Hollis family before they sold out. He was 70-some years old himself by the look of him, weathered the way a man gets from decades outdoors, wearing a canvas coat with a torn pocket and boots caked in dried mud. He held out the water jug without being asked, and Margaret took it, surprised by how thirsty she suddenly realized she was. In his other hand, he held a small brass padlock, still in its cardboard packaging, and he said he'd noticed the front hasp was broken and figured a person shouldn't be out here without some way to lock up behind herself. Margaret thanked him and reached for her purse, still sitting on the truck seat, but Walt shook his head before she'd taken 2 steps toward it. He said the lock cost him nothing worth mentioning and the water even less, and that around here neighbors didn't keep a ledger on that sort of thing. He didn't say much else about himself, only that he'd known Ruth Anders a little back when he was younger, and she was already getting on in years, and that she'd been kind to his mother once in a way he hadn't forgotten. He didn't say yes to Margaret's offer of payment, and he didn't say no either. He simply set the padlock on the porch rail, touched the brim of his cap, and said he'd let her get on with her afternoon. Margaret watched him walk back down the path until the trees swallowed him from view, and only then did she look down at the coffee can still cradled against her side. $211 did not change a person's circumstances in any way that mattered to a bank or a lawyer. But it sat in her hands like proof of something, evidence that her mother had spent her final years quietly setting things aside. Not for herself, but for whoever came looking with a genuine need. Margaret carried the can inside and set it on the kitchen counter beside the tin box, and stood a moment looking at the loose floorboard still propped against the wall, its underside marked with a chalk line she hadn't noticed before, faint but deliberate, pointing toward the chimney at the far end of the room. She did not know yet what the chalk line meant. She only knew, standing in that dim front room with the afternoon light slanting gold through the doorway, that her mother had left more behind than a house nobody wanted. She picked up the pry bar again, weighed it once in her hand, and turned toward the chimney. The chalk line on the underside of the floorboard pointed straight toward the chimney, faint but unmistakable once Margaret crouched down to study it in the slanting afternoon light. She set the pry bar aside for a moment and ran her palm along the brick facing near the base of the wood stove, feeling for anything that might explain why her mother had bothered to mark a direction at all. The mortar joints felt solid under her fingers until she reached a section at knee height, just beside the stove's cold iron door, where the brick gave slightly inward under pressure. It was not a crack so much as a seam, deliberate and nearly invisible unless a person already knew to look for it. She worked her fingers into the seam and found a single loose brick, half the depth of the others, set in without mortar, and held only by its own snug fit against its neighbors. It came free after a moment of careful wiggling, cool and gritty in her hand. And behind it, Margaret found a cavity built into the chimney's base, lined with a metal flue box gone dull with age, but otherwise intact. Inside the box sat a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with string that had gone brittle but not yet broken, and beneath it, folded into a tight square, an envelope with Margaret's name written across the front in her mother's unmistakable hand. Before she opened either one, Margaret sat back on the cold hearth and allowed herself a moment simply to breathe. If you have found comfort in stories like this one, stories of quiet people and the things they leave behind, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss where Margaret's evening leads next. She wiped her palms on her coat, the way she did before handling anything she considered fragile, and finally broke the wax seal on the envelope with the edge of her thumbnail. Inside, several pages of thin stationery were folded together, the ink faded to brown, but still perfectly legible, dated in the top corner in her mother's careful hand. The letter began plainly, the way Ruth Anders began most things, without preamble or apology for the years that had passed since she'd last spoken to her daughter in this way. She wrote that she was setting this down in the autumn of 1978, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had once taught Margaret to hem a skirt, because a woman her age had learned not to trust that tomorrow would arrive simply because today had. She wrote that she had built this cottage with her own hands, not out of pride, though pride had crept in later, but because no one else was going to build it for a widow with 3 children and a debt to no one. She wrote that watching Margaret grow into a woman who kept her own counsel and asked for help only when truly desperate had been the proudest thing she'd witnessed in a long life of witnessing. The letter went on, unhurried, the way Ruth herself had never been hurried even when the world around her demanded speed. She described the winter Harold died, the specific cold of that January, the way grief had made her hands steadier rather than shakier when she finally picked up a hammer instead of falling apart the way the neighbors expected. She wrote about Cyrus Bell extending her credit at the lumber yard against his own better judgment, about the neighbor boy who'd helped her raise the ridge beam for the price of a pie, about the particular satisfaction of driving the final nail into the porch decking and standing back to see a roof over her children's heads that owed nothing to any man's charity. She wrote that she had never told this story often because it embarrassed her a little to be proud of something so plain as a small wooden house, but that Margaret should know it now, because Margaret would need to know it soon. The pages slowed there, Ruth's handwriting growing slightly less steady, as though the pen had rested more than once between sentences. She wrote that she had watched Margaret marry Elmer and raise children of her own with the same quiet stubbornness Ruth recognized from the mirror, and that she suspected, without wanting to burden her daughter with the suspicion, that a day might come when Margaret would find herself in need of a place that asked nothing of her but her own effort. She wrote that she had set aside what little she could over the years, not enough to solve every problem, but enough, hidden the way a careful woman hides things, meant only for Margaret and no one else. She underlined the words "no one else" twice, the ink pressed hard enough to nearly tear the thin paper. Margaret read the final paragraph twice before she fully understood it. Her mother wrote that beneath the loose porch board on the north side, under a flat stone Margaret would recognize the moment she saw it, there rested the larger portion of what Ruth had managed to save across the final decade of her life, kept apart from the estate entirely and never mentioned to Carl or Louise or Dale, because Ruth had trusted only one of her children to use it the way it was meant to be used. She closed the letter simply, the way she closed most letters, with her full name signed beneath a single line that said she hoped, wherever Margaret was reading this, that she had finally stopped asking permission to take up space in her own life. Margaret set the pages down in her lap and sat very still on the cold hearth, the oilcloth bundle still unopened beside her, the last of the afternoon light moving slowly across the pine floorboards toward the doorway. She did not cry, though her throat had tightened somewhere around the paragraph about the ridge beam, and she pressed the back of one hand briefly against her mouth before letting it fall back to her lap. Outside, the walnut trees had begun casting longer shadows across the clearing, and somewhere in the brush, a mourning dove called twice and went quiet. Margaret folded the letter along its original creases, careful not to tear paper that had waited 42 years to be read, and sat a while longer simply looking at nothing in particular, letting her mother's voice settle into the room the way smoke settles after a fire has gone out. Eventually she rose, her knees protesting the hour spent kneeling on hard pine, and walked out onto the porch to look for the flat stone her mother's letter had promised would be there. The light had gone the deep gold of early evening, catching the tops of the goldenrod in the clearing, and Margaret stood a long moment on the sagging porch, simply breathing the cooling air. Whatever waited beneath that stone, she understood now that it was not the true inheritance her mother had left her. The true inheritance was already folded in her coat pocket, in a hand she would have known blind, telling her plainly that she had always belonged somewhere, even on the nights the rest of the world forgot to mention it. Margaret found the flat stone exactly where the letter said it would be, set into the ground beneath the porch's north corner, wider and smoother than the field stones scattered around it. She worked it loose with the pry bar the following morning, having spent the night in the cottage's one bedroom on a bedroll fetched from the truck, unwilling to drive back into town before she'd finished what her mother had started. Beneath the stone, wrapped in the same oilcloth as the bundle from the chimney, she found a second cache, larger than the first, bound with twine gone stiff with age. She carried it inside to the kitchen table and untied it slowly, the way a person unwraps something they suspect will change the shape of their week. Inside were bank passbooks, 4 of them from a credit union 2 towns over, that Margaret vaguely recalled her mother mentioning decades ago. The entries were sparse but steady. $5 here, $11 there. A deposit of $40 the month Margaret's father-in-law had died, and Ruth had apparently decided grief made for good saving discipline. The final entries, dated only weeks before Ruth's death, showed a balance that had been quietly transferred out entirely. The passbook itself left behind as a record of where the money had gone rather than proof it still existed. Tucked behind the passbooks was a certified check, uncashed, drawn against an account Margaret didn't recognize, made out in her name for $61,400. Margaret sat with the check in both hands for a long while, the kitchen quiet except for the tick of the old stove cooling from the small fire she'd built the night before. She did not know yet whether a check that old could still be honored by any bank, and she suspected the answer involved lawyers and paperwork and patience she would need to summon from somewhere. What she understood immediately, without needing a banker to explain it, was the scale of what her mother had managed to set aside across 3 decades of a widow's modest income. A sum large enough to matter, and small enough that Ruth had clearly built it dollar by dollar, rather than inherited it from anyone. She set the check carefully back into the oilcloth and looked up to find a truck she didn't recognize idling at the edge of the clearing. The truck was newer than anything else that had come down that lane in years. A black extended cab with dealer plates still bracketed on the front, its paint too clean for the dust it had just driven through. A man climbed out, mid-50s, dressed in pressed khakis and a golf shirt that looked out of place against the goldenrod and broken porch boards. He introduced himself as Roy Casterline, said he represented a small development group interested in the parcel, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd been keeping an eye on the property for some time now, waiting to see if anyone would ever come to claim it. Margaret came out onto the porch, the oilcloth bundle still in one hand, and said only that she was Ruth Anders's daughter, and the property was hers. Casterline's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes recalculated. He said he understood, and that made things simpler, actually, since he'd rather deal with a direct owner than an estate tangled in probate. He named a figure, spoken lightly, as though the number itself was an act of generosity, enough to cover what he called the inconvenience of dealing with a property in this condition. Margaret did not answer right away. She had learned long ago from Elmer and from her mother both that silence often did more work in a negotiation than any counteroffer, and she let it stretch a beat longer than was comfortable for the man standing in her mother's yard. When she finally spoke, she said only that she hadn't decided what she planned to do with the property yet. Casterline's smile thinned slightly at that, and he mentioned, in the same easy tone, that properties like this one sometimes ran into complications with back taxes, complications that could move quickly if left unattended, and that his group had relationships at the county office that could make such complications either disappear or accelerate, depending on how things went. He said it the way a man says something he wants remembered rather than answered, and Margaret understood the shape of the threat even wrapped as it was in pleasantries. She said she appreciated him stopping by and that she'd be in touch if her plans changed. He left his card on the porch rail, beside the padlock Walt had left the day before, and told her not to wait too long to think it over, since offers like his didn't stay on the table indefinitely in a county this small. Margaret watched him climb back into the clean truck and turn it carefully in the narrow clearing, the tires spitting gravel in a way the dirt lane rarely saw. She stood on the porch until the sound of his engine faded into the walnut trees, and then she looked down at the card in her hand, embossed lettering on heavy stock, a phone number, and a company name she didn't recognize. She set it on the porch rail next to Walt's padlock and went back inside without deciding anything at all. Inside, she sat back down at the kitchen table with the check and the passbook spread before her, and found herself thinking not of Casterline's number, but of her mother's handwriting, of the words no one else underlined twice in that letter by the wood stove. Whatever back taxes existed on this property, whatever complications a man in a clean truck could accelerate or make disappear, Margaret understood plainly now that this was not a piece of land to be traded away for a convenient sum. It was the last unfinished sentence in a conversation her mother had started 30 years before either of them knew it would matter. She folded the passbooks back into the oilcloth, tucked the check inside her coat pocket alongside the letter, and looked out the window at the lengthening afternoon light falling across the goldenrod. She did not yet know what shape the coming weeks would take, whether Casterline's threat about taxes was bluff or genuine leverage, whether the county would honor a deed that had sat forgotten for 2 decades. She knew only that she was done letting other people decide, in easy, pleasant voices, what belonged to her and what did not. Margaret rose from the table, walked out onto the porch, and looked down the dirt lane toward the place where the clean black truck had disappeared among the trees. Whatever came next, she intended to meet it standing on ground her mother had built with her own 2 hands, and she did not plan to be moved from it easily. The notice arrived by certified mail, 11 days later, forwarded from Margaret's old address to a post office box she'd opened in town, almost without thinking about why. It cited a tax lien on the County Road 9 parcel. Back taxes accrued across the 2 decades the deed had sat forgotten, with a redemption deadline printed in bold at the bottom of the page. The amount was larger than Margaret had expected, though not larger than she could manage if she was careful. And she recognized immediately the hand of Roy Casterline in how quickly the county's attention had turned to a property that had sat quiet for 20 years without complaint. She folded the notice into her coat pocket alongside her mother's letter and drove into the county seat that same afternoon. The recorder's office was busier than it had been on her first visit, and Margaret waited nearly 40 minutes before a clerk was free to see her. When her turn came, she found herself seated across from Denise Okafor again, the same young woman who had pulled the original file weeks before, though today Denise looked pale and distracted, in a way that had nothing to do with Margaret's paperwork. Margaret explained the lien and the deadline, and Denise pulled up the file with hands that trembled slightly on the keyboard, apologizing twice for typos that weren't really typos at all. When Margaret finally asked if something was wrong, Denise's composure slipped for just a moment before she managed to say, "She was fine, thank you, and could Margaret please repeat the parcel number?" Margaret recognized the look on the girl's face because she had worn it herself 11 days earlier on a porch that no longer belonged to her. She did not press the matter in the office, surrounded by other clerks and a line of impatient residents, but she left her name and the post office box number on a slip of paper before she left, the way a person leaves a door unlocked without saying so directly. 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, Denise appeared at the cottage in a car that idled roughly and sounded like it needed work Denise clearly could not afford. She stood at the edge of the clearing the way Margaret imagined she herself might have stood, uncertain whether she had any right to be there at all. Denise explained, haltingly at first and then all at once, that she had been evicted from her apartment 4 days earlier after her landlord sold the building without proper notice, and that she had nowhere else to go on such short notice besides her car and whatever she could carry. She said she remembered Margaret's face from the office, remembered that Margaret had once stood in a similarly hollowed-out silence over a piece of paper, and she had driven out here without any real plan beyond needing somewhere quiet to think. Margaret did not ask why Denise had chosen this particular dirt lane over any other quiet place in the county. She simply said there was a spare room, more or less weatherproofed now, and put the kettle on the stove she'd gotten working again. Over the following days, Denise stayed in exchange for nothing Margaret asked of her, though she insisted on helping anyway, sweeping floors and hauling water and mentioning, almost too casually, that she'd overheard something at the office that Margaret needed to know. The tax lien, Denise said, had been flagged for accelerated processing at the specific request of a private party, a courtesy the county rarely extended and almost never to individuals rather than institutions. Casterline's company had apparently made a habit of this particular maneuver across 3 other parcels in the past 2 years, each time acquiring land cheaply from owners pressured by sudden deadlines they hadn't created themselves. Margaret listened without interrupting, filing the information away the same steady way she'd once filed away lesson plans decades earlier. Word of the situation spread through the small community the way word always spreads in places where everyone still recognizes everyone else's truck on the road. Walt Pruitt mentioned it at the feed store, and the man behind the counter mentioned it to his wife, who happened to be the daughter of a woman Ruth Anders had once sat with through a difficult childbirth in 1953. With no doctor for 11 miles and nothing but her own steady hands. Stories began surfacing that Margaret had never heard before, small and specific, of coats left anonymously on porches in hard winters, of grocery bills quietly settled at the general store, of a stranger's rent paid in cash the same month Ruth herself had been scraping by on canning money. Nobody had ever put the stories together before, because Ruth had never once let anyone connect them to her name. A week before the redemption deadline, a dozen or so residents showed up unannounced at a county commission meeting, where Casterline's development group had a routine matter on the agenda, an easement request unrelated to Margaret's parcel, but public enough to draw a crowd once word got around. Walt spoke first, plain and brief, about a padlock and a jug of water, and a debt he said he'd been trying to repay for 30 years without ever finding the right moment. Others followed, each with some small memory of Ruth Anders folded quietly into their family's history, until the room understood, without anyone stating it directly, exactly what kind of woman had built that cottage, and exactly what kind of man was trying to take it from her daughter through a technicality. The commission did not rule on Margaret's lien that night, since it wasn't officially on the agenda, but the county attorney present took careful notes, and within days the accelerated processing on Margaret's parcel was quietly reversed, extended instead to the standard timeline every other property owner received. Casterline did not return to the cottage in person again. His card remained on the porch rail where Margaret had left it, and eventually Denise used it to prop open the kitchen window on humid afternoons, a use Margaret found she did not mind at all. The lien itself was resolved within the month, paid in part from the recovered cash, and settled the rest of the way through a payment plan Margaret arranged herself, without needing anyone's permission to do it. Denise stayed on through the following weeks, first as a guest and then, without either of them quite deciding it formally, as something closer to family. Margaret found herself, on quiet evenings, telling Denise the same stories about Ruth that Ruth had once told her. The lumber yard, the $41, the wall raised without a single man's hand on the hammer. Denise listened the way Margaret herself once had, and helped scrape old paint from the porch railings on weekends when she wasn't working, saying little about how much the help meant, but showing it plainly in the steadiness of her hands. Margaret watched her some evenings from the kitchen window, sanding a railing in the fading light, and thought that her mother would have approved of exactly this kind of quiet repayment, passed forward rather than paid back. Spring came slowly to County Road 9, the way it always had. Mud season giving way to green in fits and starts that tested a person's patience. Margaret spent it with a hammer in her hand more often than not, replacing the rotted porch post first, then the broken window glass, then the missing courses of chimney stone one Saturday at a time with help from Walt, who showed up most weekends now without being asked, the way he'd shown up that first afternoon with a jug of water and a padlock. Denise worked alongside them when her hours at the county office allowed, sanding railings and repainting the kitchen cabinets a pale green Margaret remembered from childhood. though she couldn't have said for certain if the color was memory or invention. The sewing machine came out of its towel in April and found a permanent place by the front window, the one that had once held the mysterious lace curtain, now replaced with a plainer one Margaret had hemmed herself on a quiet evening. She never did learn who had hung that first curtain or stacked that tidy woodpile, though she suspected, without ever asking him directly, that Walt had been keeping a quiet eye on the place for years before she arrived, tending it the way a person tends a grave they visit without announcing the visits. She thought of asking him once on a Tuesday afternoon while they worked side by side reglazing a window frame, and decided against it. Some kindnesses were better left unclaimed, the giver satisfied simply in the doing. The certified check took longer to resolve than the tax lien had, winding through a bank's legal department for the better part of 2 months before it finally cleared. $61,400 deposited into an account Margaret opened in her own name at the same credit union her mother had once used. She did not spend it quickly or carelessly. She paid off the remaining tax balance in full, put a new roof on the cottage before the next winter could test the old one further, and set the remainder aside in the same slow, deliberate way her mother once had. A little here, a little there, without any particular plan beyond knowing it would matter to someone eventually. Her son Daniel called twice that spring, tentative, mentioning the property in passing, as though testing whether the door back to their relationship had reopened at all. Margaret answered both calls civilly and did not offer him a key. By midsummer, the cottage looked less like a ruin and more like the plain, sturdy house Ruth Anders had built, with her own 2 hands, 70-odd years earlier, weathered but sound, the kind of structure that asked nothing of anyone beyond ordinary upkeep. Margaret planted vegetables in the cleared patch behind the woodshed, which Walt had rebuilt from salvaged lumber over the course of 3 long weekends, and the old apple tree, pruned back hard in early spring, put out more blossoms than it had managed in years. Denise moved into a small apartment in town that August, close enough for regular visits, far enough to have a life fully her own, and she came back most Sundays for supper, the way family does without needing the arrangement formally named. On a Thursday evening in early September, a year and some months after the night the locks had been changed against her, Margaret sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea going lukewarm beside her, watching the light fade gold and then gray over the goldenrod field. It was there, in that particular hour, that headlights turned slowly off the dirt lane and into the clearing, a battered sedan. She didn't recognize easing to a stop near the old boulder at the bend. A young man climbed out, perhaps 25, carrying a duffel bag and wearing the particular careful stillness of someone who wasn't certain he had the right to be standing where he was standing. He explained, once Margaret had risen to meet him at the bottom of the steps, that he was Ruth Anders's great-nephew on her late husband's side, a branch of the family Margaret had lost track of decades ago, and that he'd fallen on difficult circumstances after losing his job and then his apartment inside the same brutal month. He said he'd found an old address in some family papers and driven out on little more than a hope that someone might still be living at the end of this particular road. Margaret looked at him a long moment in the fading light, at the duffel bag and the tired set of his shoulders, and felt something settle into place the way a board settles once it's been properly nailed down. She did not ask him many questions that first evening. She told him there was a spare room, more or less finished now, and put the kettle back on the stove for a second pot of tea. He sat at the kitchen table where Margaret had once counted $211 in worn bills and coin, and ate a plate of food without much talking, the particular quiet of a person who had not expected kindness and did not yet trust it. Margaret recognized the posture. She had worn it herself, not so very long ago, on a night when the world had made it plain she was not wanted anywhere at all. Later, after the young man had gone to bed and the house had settled into its evening creaks and silences, Margaret stepped back out onto the porch and switched on the light Walt had wired for her that spring. a single bulb in a simple glass fixture that threw a soft yellow circle over the steps and the path beyond. She sat down again with her tea gone properly cold now and looked out at the dark shape of the goldenrod field, the walnut trees black against a sky just beginning to show its first stars. Somewhere behind her, faintly, she could hear the young man's steady breathing through the thin bedroom wall, a sound of someone finally allowed to rest. Margaret thought of her mother then, not with grief exactly, but with something quieter and steadier, a kind of company that didn't require words. She thought of the letter folded now in a cedar box on her dresser, of the line about no longer asking permission to take up space in one's own life. And she understood, sitting there in the porch light with the night settling in around her, that the cycle her mother had started so many decades ago had simply found its next hand to pass through. A house is just boards and nails until someone decides what it means. Margaret finished her tea, set the empty cup on the step beside her, and sat a while longer in the quiet, the porch light glowing steady over the dirt lane. The whole clearing settled into the kind of stillness that comes only after something long unfinished has finally been set right.